starting with this one. A dozen, a gross, and a score, plus 3 times the square root of 4, divided by 7, plus 5 times 11, is 9 squared and not a bit more. Along with being an accurate mathematical equation, this is a limerick, which is a form of verse with a strict rhyme scheme of an AABBA, such as the more recognizable one like this, which is saying, as one can read, there was a young lady whose bonnet came untied when the birds sat upon it. But she said, I don't care. All the birds in the air are welcome to sit on my bonnet. So this one was by the English illustrator and poet Edward Lear. So his illustrations helped make limericks very popular through his 1864 publication, A Book of Nonsense. So here's another one by Mr. Lear, which reads, there was an old person whose habits induced him to feed upon rabbits. When he'd eaten 18, he turned perfectly green, upon which he relinquished those habits. So Lear also wrote poems, and one of the most memorable ones by Lear is The Owl and the Pussycat. I believe I was told there are many fans of that poem here with us. So this is the actual illustration, the original monocopy of it done by Edward Lear. And over the years, illustrations galore has conveyed the story without even mentioning one word. One of my favorite ones, one of the most memorable reinterpretation for me is this one by Yorisk. In this version, we see a very blue-blooded owl, who is evidenced by this alley of generational portraits. You can see it hanging on the wall. And it's also a nice addition that you see the bovine help mindlessly working in the front. It is a very rich world of artistic interpretations. To continue this impression of a wealthy backdrop, we have a rather Homeric looking statue of the owl as well up ahead. And if you look at the vista, one is reminded as if looking at the very tony world of the Gatsby's West Egg. So the owl is definitely got a nice nest egg. Through the illustrations, the narrative continues to, and I love this, Catburg Station. Everything is done with such charm and thought. Very, very amusing, actually. It's like, meow. But the cleverness continues. We also have, as the bus is going, Dogstown, Cowville, Out of Town. You can see them, all of them marked up here in the information section. This is really, really smartly done. And then what happens? Whom does our owl spot? And notice this too. It says on the other side of the tracks, take it literally and figuratively. Who is that perfect picture of elegance, lithe and aloof? She soon becomes his destination, or rather they become each other's destination. Smitten kitten, as is the owl. So shall we read the poem to see how they sailed off into the sunset? Off we go. The owl and the pussycat went to sea in a beautiful pea green boat. They took some honey and plenty of money wrapped up in a 5-pound note. The owl looked up to the stars above and sang to a small guitar. Oh, lovely pussy, oh, pussy, my love, what a beautiful pussy you are. You are, what a beautiful pussy you are. Pussy said to the owl, you elegant fowl, how charmingly sweet you sing. Oh, let us be married. Too long we have tarried, but what shall we do for a ring? They sailed away for a year and a day to the land where the bong trees grow. And there in a wood, a piggy wig stood, with the ring at the end of his nose. His nose, with the ring at the end of his nose. Dear pig, are you willing to sell for 1 shilling your ring? Said the piggy. I will. So they took it away and were married next day by the turkey who lives on the hill. They dined on mince and slices of quince, which they ate with a runcible spoon. And hand in hand, on the edge of the sand, they danced by the light of the moon. The moon, the moon. They danced by the light of the moon. A very, very warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for sharing your afternoon with us for our 61st presentation. The vehicle is poetry. The subject is actually the destination, which we continue to approach with every succeeding slide. So here is Edward Lear, the author of The Owl and the Pussycat. I was struck by the description that, and I quote, his poems can be characterized by his irreverent view of the world, closed quotes. Far from it. They are far from irreverent. It's best not to believe everything one reads. Edward Lear was a gifted musician and composer, and his poems are actually songs. They're like lieders, those German song cycles that are based on poems. Schubert easily comes to mind, his Winterreise Circle. So approach Lear's work like lieders, songs. Lear also happens to be one of the greatest natural history painters. The Jumblies are obviously not an example of natural history work, but Lear used to do a bunch of the work for John Gould, who John Gould rivals Audubon in terms of natural painting. So Lear is a fabulously talented painter. And some of his works are in Harvard's Houghton Library and actually much closer to home. So if you're ever able, simply walk the corridors of the working space at our Chicago's Natural History Museum, and you will see Lear's drawing of the owl in one of the corridors there. And the artwork along those side halls of our museum is remarkable. They're a collection unto themselves. And I'm not joking, the cartography along the walls is worth any amount of trouble you need to get through to get access to those things. It's fascinating. But Edward Lear's insatiable curiosity, his artistic talent, and zeal for hard work were really his intellectual passport into the rarefied circle of scholars, of explorers, of wealthy patrons at the time during which he lived, which was a very important time for our history, because among other things, those were the times of Charles Darwin. So now look at the honeymoon scene from his best known poem, The Owl and the Pussycat Went to Sea. Look with the discernment now. Birds, animals, interspecies relationship. I am not joking. So at the auction house Bonhams a few years ago, one of his drawings came up for sale. I obviously couldn't afford it because I wanted it. And what it actually was, it was an owly pussycat. It was an owl above the waist. It was part little beast and it was part fowl. It was a hybrid. I think it might interest you to know that he had written a follow-up where the pussycat committed suicide. The owl brings up the children alone as a single parent. Edward Lear was most certainly bisexual. This hybridization, his repressed sexuality, lends an even more interesting aspect to his work. And that is why I love poetry. Poetry reveals the poignant expression of being a human being. You must look carefully to find love in unexpected form. Isn't that what Owl and the Pussycat is? Does one have the courage to recognize love if it comes in an unexpected shape? Does one have the courage also to admit to it and then to commit to it? And so when I see poems, the best way to approach poems is with, where does this poem go? Instead of, what does the poem mean? Or what is this poem trying to say? Because when a teacher asks, what is this poem trying to say? You're already implying the author failed, which is far from the truth. So it's best to say, what is the journey the poem is taking? Because poetry invites us to take an imaginative journey, doesn't it? The notion of travel, self-discovery, is my point of intersection in any discussion of poetry. So can you guess where destination is going to be when poetry is the vehicle for this presentation? I'm pretty sure you already know. So the Nourishment Project is about joyous curiosity and being part of something much larger than ourselves that has never been more true than today's subject. So instead of references, here are some recommendations. Poets that I really enjoy. Vladimir Nabokov's writings affords its own ecstasies. And please know, he's very funny and he writes some very shrewd jokes. In one of the writings, his florist's, one of his character, florist's wife, is named, check this out, Mrs. D. Forrest. I mean, he's just fun to read him. Brilliant writer. Enjoy these works. And there's obviously in that list a glaring lack of Chinese and Indian references. And that is because these cultures, China and India, are worlds unto themselves, both in their poetry and their music. They stand alone. And you have to do eons of history to really get huge due diligence to get what they sometimes imply, because it's often implied and they're very referential. So please, if possible, try to read the translations of the Tang Dynasty narrative poem masterpiece, The Song of Everlasting Sorrow. It is about the romance and tragic death of a beautiful imperial consort. The reason I'm sharing this is because this is the poem that inspired, which nowadays I guess you might say influenced, the world-renowned Japanese treasure, The Tale of Genji. Most people don't realize that. Written by the Japanese authoress, so Tale of Genji is super famous. The description there, just the way that they describe colors is mesmerizing. So the authoress is Murasaki Shikibu. And what's interesting, this is so interesting on so many levels. Back then, this is like around 10th, 11th century, women wrote in their own script in Japan, because during those times, because China was the apogee of culture, Japan copied pretty much everything China had, except they made it their own. And as Japanese are wont to do, they elevated everything that they found. So the Japanese court aristocracy wrote in Chinese. And so the script that had been created by these women, like Murasaki Shikibu, eventually results in the Japanese script that we know today, kanji. So, every slide in this presentation deserves an hour of its own. Do please go down rabbit holes at your own spare time. You will be richly rewarded. And so poems have been around, though, longer than Tale of Genji, Song of Everlasting Sorrow, much earlier than the 10th century. So what we see here is the allegory scene where Homer is standing in the center, reciting poetry. Apollo, the god of poets, listens intently by his side. Homeric poems originally evolved orally, and this is before the development of writing in Greece, and they were performed and passed down from bard to bard to bard. After being passed orally from generation to generation, the poems must have been refined when they were written down for the first time. And two most famous Homeric poems are, we all know these, the Iliad, approximately 15,693 lines, and the other one is the Odyssey, the Iliad and the Odyssey are conventionally dated. Remember, they were originally oral, to about the late 8th or early 7th century BCE, BCE being before current era. And so the Odyssey is composed of 134,000, a little bit more than that, words, which is the equivalent reading time of 9 hours for the average reader with a speed of about 250 words per minute. So in terms of sheer number of lines, that's about 12,109 lines in the Odyssey. Imagine memorizing those, because that's how they were transferred. Generation after generation, people memorize them. And memorization matters. Cambridge University's Department of Neuroscience has evidence that as one grows older, learning poetry will, without question, keep dementia at bay. The brain is a muscle. Keep it active. Memorize poetry every day. So approach poets and poetry as pharmacology. They are your new Walgreens and CVS. It will do very good for all of us. So if you view poetry as medicine, here is natural therapy from India, containing some 50,000 lines of Sanskrit text, one of the two major epic poems from that subcontinent. This one is the Ramayana. The second one being, and that second one is roughly 10 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. 1.8 million words, the epic Indian poem, the Mahabharata. So the Mahabharata is 4 times the length of the Ramayana. Imagine memorizing those year after year after year. Hymns chanted, sung glory. So these arias exalted into the heavens. And the earliest date for Mahabharat's compilation is about 3rd century BCE. So it was composed over about 600 years. Starting earliest date is 3rd century BCE. That's 300 years before starting point 0. However, that is nothing compared to the earliest poet known to mankind. And in the supreme level of irony, it's a woman. 23rd century BCE, that's 2,300 years prior to our context zero, so about 5,000 years ago. She's the poetess from Mesopotamia known as Enheduanna, and she was the priestess of Nana. So Nana is the goddess from Mesopotamia who's also known as Inanna, Ishtar, Astarte, who eventually becomes Aphrodite, because we've been learning from each other throughout history. So religion and poetry, these are realms of the senses, and they've always been yoked together, because across all cultures, Islam, Buddhism, chanting is there, because poetry invites us to travel to new realms, from learned intellect to realizations, to the realms of consciousness, and much beyond. Because what poetry does, what this vehicle does, is allows us to journey into silence. That is what poetry does, at least for sure to me. So where did my poetic journey begin? Well, it began in elocution classes in India. Loads of mindless memorization. Things like I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over dales and hills. Don't get me wrong, I really like poetry. But one must pay attention. To an Indian child in Kolkata, daffodils make no sense. I had never seen it. Hibiscus, bougainvilleas, a cornucopia of flowers. Roses, all of them, lotuses, yes, but daffodils, I had zero clue what that was. The sheer irony of that is not lost on me, but it's always contextualized, isn't it? Because if you think about it, what is the point of memorizing a poem about stars during daylight? But that's what we do. School upon school. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. Or through that, you must wonder Have you ever seen a star during the day when most of the students start droning this during school hours? It's bright outside. Now imagine learning this lullaby, not under the blazing star known as the sun, but actually under the night sky, where they look up in wonder and say, yeah, how I do wonder where you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. When the blazing sun is gone, when he nothing shines upon, then you show your little light, twinkle, twinkle all the night. Then the traveler in the dark thanks you for your tiny spark. He could not see which way to go if you did not twinkle so. In the dark blue sky you keep, and often through my curtains peep, for you never shut your eye till the sun is in your sky. 'Tis your bright and tiny spark lights the traveler in the dark, though I know not what you are. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. The simple grace of reading this or being read to by the parents or someone else at night makes all the difference to make a poem pure magic. It opens up a child within. Some of you will be attending, for example, Luigi, the Symphony Hall concert tonight, Carmina Burana, composed between 1935 1936. It's actually based on 24 poems from medieval literature. Though one may not realize it now, it was intentionally written as entertainment rather than a religious purpose. It has no religious purpose whatsoever, because the piece is actually subtitled, and I quotes, secular songs for singers and choruses to be sung together with instruments and magic images. Now, I truly, truly hope to see magic images because I will be at the symphony tonight. Be true to form, show me some magic images because that's what it's meant to be. So Carmina Burana means songs of Buren. So Buren is a Benedictine monastery in Bavaria. Its most famous piece, which I'm sure we will hear tonight, is O Fortuna, Lady Fortune, spin your wheel. The actual poem is very practical. Actually, the poems themselves are very practical. So this illustration is from 1400, and she's quite the Vanna White, isn't she? But the poem itself was from about 1200 CE, which is current era. So the original poems, and one of the texts is shown here. And I'm going to read another one because they're very contextual and relatable even to this date. So I'll read the one that you don't see now. So it says, money being testified makes a mockery of law. Equity, though on their side, counts for nothing to the poor. Wealthy clients quickly spied, quicker still are catered for. Judges so adore it, they'll move mountains for it. Doesn't it make sense, this idea of corruption? But you know, we Chicagoans, we don't know anything about corruptions because we certainly do not have any history of corruption whatsoever. So how could we possibly relate to this poem? I don't know, could be. But this is not the only poem that is turned into a song, which the symphony has performed and will continue to perform. Another German poem, because Carmina Burana is German, but the composition is not going to be done by a German today. So another poem put to song is Beethoven's Ode to Joy, because that is a poem written by the German poet Schiller. So Ode to Joy is part of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and Beethoven, the composer, had included new texts to Schiller's poems and to Schiller's words. But I always marvel just to have a sense of fun. That Lakeshore Drive is littered with some of the most intellectual poets across from our history. Because Goethe's Faust is a tragic play in 2 acts, but nearly all of part 1 and the majority of part 2 are written in rhythmic verse. But the reason I'm including this, if you ever visit Chicago, because we had friends visiting in town, if you ever want to go to Goethe Street, please don't say Goethe. You have to tell the cabs and probably the CTA, go iti, because they will not respond to Goethe whatsoever. That said, here is actually the sentence that made me fall in love with language around the grades 8 or 9, at least with the English language. I had been, and I remember this distinctly, it was in early high school, so 8th grade, I believe. I had been struck by the term crepuscular, language as an art form. And though this was prose, it obviously turned me on to poetry. The oddity is this is a translation in English from an Indian line. That's why I was very curious. What is this crepuscular? The ambiguity that rests in poems really draws me because it alludes to complexity, because we are complex creatures, we aren't caricatures. For me, the language of poetry creates more than describes worlds because it opens us up. That shape shifting component of one's own identity finds an ever matching glove in great poetry, even more than a book does for me. So, just this weekend, as Gary mentioned, over this Saturday and the Friday before, there was the launch of the non-profit arm, the educational organization arm of the Nourishment Projects. So that arm is called the Nourishment Projects NFP, NFP being not for profit. Some of you, like Gary, were there. So thank you for your support. And I really hope you had a good time. And here are some of the children from our opera workshops that were there. It was great fun. I was very, very proud to share the work we've been doing with learning for the last, actually more than 8 years. And it was really wonderful to see some of the children there dressed up, celebrating with us. My board and I are very grateful for the time and support people provided. And I thank my board member, Pam, always. It's a joy to learn and work with you. And we will endeavor to champion curiosity and courage, the courage to live life joyously. We have no larger purpose. We aren't solving a problem. We work on a completely different scale. We encourage and give support and say yes. The desire to live a joyous life is very, very worthy indeed. And poetry has always been a treasured method for our learning process. So here's a child's response to a poem by Robert Frost. And so what had happened here, we show video and then we read a poem and we expect them to make connections. If you can see the poem, the video that was shown was an observatory in the Atacama Desert in South America. And the part of the poem that was read to them was, I'm going to read now. They cannot scare me with the empty spaces between stars on stars where no human race is. I have it in me so much nearer home to scare myself with my own desert places. And then the children were allowed to discuss, and then they write down privately. That's what you see them doing week after week. They write their responses down. Here is a written response from an 8-year-old, sorry, a 12-year-old boy, so in 8th grade. And this is from 2018, because we've been doing this for a while. He put the two aspects together, the video and the poem. And he wrote, among other things, I also learned that Robert Frost used his entire poem as a metaphor. The metaphor is past and future. The future is that empty space. The stars is a reference to the past because by the time you see the light of a star, it already exploded. What that child is talking about is pure physics. The light it takes from a star to reach us, it's traveling in light years. He puts that together to put disparate things together. It's amazing what poetry makes us do. I cannot emphasize how much I value poetry and to be evidence to this kind of learning, forming of a human being. It's a blessing and a privilege for me. Thank you for supporting work like this. And that was in 2018. This was earlier this week on Monday. What you see here, this is Dr. Foreman Bandama from Field Museum. And here are the two classes. There's about 40 students in there because you'll see them hidden in the back. And he was sharing, Dr. Bandama was sharing about the stone formations in Senegal. These megaliths have been there from nearly 1200 BCE. Most of us just know about Stonehenge, but you have megaliths all over Africa, not just in Senegal. And because we were co-hosting, the children also learned about that beautiful cadence, dressed in your color that is life, in your form that is beauty. I grew up in your shadow. So that line is really about Africa. And the poet who wrote that line is Leopold Senghor, who was the president of Senegal. Doesn't it make you wonder, how does a ruler with that level of mental refinement rule? Follow that train of thought. What if our Congress and Senate, if the Congress and senators had a poetic leaning? Would there still be these egregious levels of rancor among the leaders that apparently lead us? I doubt it. How could they be so sometimes vile if they had that level of refinement? We once had a president who also wrote poems, our sixth president, John Quincy Adams. And following his presidency, John Quincy Adams returned to Congress and had served nearly 17 years in the House of Representatives, where he had earned the nickname Old Man Eloquent. He does look like an eloquent human being, doesn't he? But American eloquence, I'm very proud to say, has not withered in the last nearly 2 centuries since the time of American President Adams. Part of that recommendation poet list, and I beseech you to discover her, if you haven't already, the American beauty, Mary Oliver. The reason I'm not reading her, I can't really start weeping so early in a presentation. And also recommended W.S. Merwin, One of the Butterflies. His work often has no punctuations, and his work renders my mind quiet. I'll read this. The trouble with pleasure is the timing. It can overtake me without warning and be gone before I knew it is here. It can stand facing me unrecognized while I am remembering somewhere else, in another age or someone not seen for years and never to be seen again in this world. And it seems I cherish only now a joy I was not aware of when it was here, although it remains out of reach and will not be caught or named or called back. And if I could make it stay as I want to, it would turn into pain. Just let that to linger in words like this is a gift beyond compare to me. And when that spiritual butterfly lands, it's magic. And a physical garden for those proverbial poetic butterflies is a Shakespearean garden, a Shakespeare garden. And a traditional Shakespeare garden features a broad variety of plants based on the bard's Renaissance writings. From Hamlet, there are pansies, fennel, a willow tree, and rosemary. From Romeo and Juliet, there would be a pomegranate tree. From Midsummer Night's Dream, violets and thyme. From A Winter's Tale, there would be daffodils and carnations. And of course, as one can see, daisies from Love's Labor Lost. And now from the Far East, poetry aligned perfectly with gardens. What is being depicted in this painting? The winding stream parties from the Heian period, which is 8th through the 12th century CE. CE is current era. So this was a game for nobles. The participants composed a poem besides a stream within a set time limit. And it was set by the passage of a lacquer cup of sake floating towards poets. So these are groups of poets sitting along the stream. And so the sake cup would float along the water. When the cup reached the poet, the expectation was to drink its contents, either as a celebration of a poem's completion, rather, or as a forfeit. If you didn't complete the poem, the poet had to drink the sake. Either way, you're drinking. That idea of a winding stream party for a poem is embodied in a garden design right here. And that can only be understood through historic reference, because context is everything. So the reason I'm showing you this garden is a poem, a silent, powerful poem. These rocks, imagine, are the sake cups floating down the stream. I love the human mind. Keep looking what the Japanese can do. Simple words. The critical subtlety of just one word, as evidenced by the Japanese poet Basho. The bee staggers out of the peony, staggers, drunk with honey, intoxicated with pleasure. The bee didn't simply fly out. That would be the efficient thing to say, right? But who cares about efficiency? Creativity has nothing to do with efficiency. Why would you want it? Words matter because pleasure resides in them. And poems do show up in other forms, in other visual forms. I'll quickly show you one or two. So look, George Herbert's, the poem's wings. You can see that right there. These two wings one sees, perhaps of birds or angels. They're illustrating the textual content, the writer's desire to reach skyward towards his Lord. So this is a pattern poem in which the shape is meant to be appreciated by the reader. Here's a more modern one. You love this one. Talk about love all. This poem is using structure and subject matter in an ingenious way to get its theme across. It's about tennis. Look at that. Middle-aged couple playing tennis. When the game ends and they go home, the net will still be between them. Rather ominous, but look how cleverly they do it. A clever poetess of our times. And this is because I want to make sure everyone knows I just don't delve in history. I do delve with all the current times. This poet has 400,000 TikTok followers. Considering the subject matter as poem, that's a remarkable number of followers of young generation who are following poetry even today. So the author is Jay Maya, a Harvard student who has turned into a social media. I think she's trying to write a book now. Now, I can guess what her Indian parents' reaction to that career choice was. I'm going to not be Harvard. I'm going to become a social media poem. I can guarantee you what her Indian parents might have reacted to. I have a very good idea what that would have been. However, the girl's love for Greek mythology is plainly evident in her work. I'm going to read just a snippet. She had written, I swear on my life and the river Styx, I never thought it'd be you I'd miss. Now I'm dangling by the ankle somewhere cold, like Sisyphus pushing that rock uphill, or echo falling for a daffodil. You lured me like a siren to the shore. Clever, clever, clever writing. It's really fun. But what I like about her, she just really surprises. She's also a punning champion. Can you believe that? And so, among other things, what she had said, because she was supposed to make a pun about literature, and she had instantly come up with, I take my sewing really seriously because I've always been a fan of the Ernest Hemingway. Can you imagine how clever that is to come up with that in an instant? She's really something else. I was quite surprised, delighted by her. Another witty pun, because puns are wordplay. Here we go. Not by her. Look here. John Donne and Donne, undone. What does that say about the state of their marriage, the marriage between John Donne and Anne Donne? Don't get me wrong, John Donne was besotted with his wife, Anne Moore, before she became Anne Donne. So John Donne, a priest and a poet, is a wonder. The aesthetic pleasure of John Donne's work is the expansion of one's mind. He writes like no one else. In a sermon, because he did become a priest later, he had described the world that waits for us after death as, and I quote, an infinite, a super infinite, unimaginable space. So that word super infinite, imagine, mathematical concepts from a 16th century clergy. And I promise you, investing in this 400-year-old poet brings both moral profit and aesthetic pleasure. The poems that he has written and is most well known for were written years before he joined the Anglican Church, because he was born into Catholicism. And during the times, the Elizabeth I period, being a Catholic was not the best way to go. So he converted. And the visuals here allude more to the carnal than the clergy, because look what the first lines of his poem says. Busy old fool, unruly son, why dost thou thus? Through windows and through curtains call on us. Must to thy motions lovers' seasons run? So obviously, you know, they've been romping on the bed, he and his mistress. I love his work. They're witty and great, but just you wait, you keep on reading. He will shock you. And you will recognize his works because they are reflected in that of others. For example, lines like, for whom the bell tolls, a very recognizable title. So you can easily guess whom Hemingway admired. Donne was also most widely known in his lifetime, again, as a priest and as the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. And he was the dean from 1621 to the end of his life. He was one of the cathedral's most prominent clergymen. He was a celebrated preacher, and his performances, and they were performances, drew thousands. Considering his times were politically and religiously volatile, because the times of Elizabeth I, remember, Queen, the Virgin Queen, England is just fomenting, coming into power. Church of England established by her father, Catholic France, Catholic Spain despise England. These are the times of the Spanish Armadas. England is fighting for supremacy or trying to get supremacy against the Spanish Empire. Times are rough. Catholicism, by every definition, is practically a guaranteed death sentence for if you're living in England. So now read John Donne's writing contextually. He wrote, for example, at the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels. Just look at that. Like Basho, look at the word imagined corners of a round earth. Spheres don't have corners, do they? So in context of the scientific revolution of his time, so during his times, you have the scientists Copernicus, Kepler. They have proved the world is not flat. Angels are not standing guarding the four corners. And so this clergyman, his poem acknowledges that. And since we know that the earth is a sphere and not flat, its corners can only be a figure of speech. Perhaps the scriptures can't be taken at face value either. But if so, who's to say that the angels too aren't imagined, along with the redemption that they herald? Do you see what he is writing? It is amazing to read a poem in context of when it was written, not from our times. And to John Donne, a thought was an experience. If you know me at all, you can know why I coo over this poet. John Donne was highly regarded as a poet in his lifetime, although he had never published a book of poems. The larger number of surviving handwritten copies of his work show that it was eagerly shared by his connoisseurs. He goes on to pen lines like such as, the sun is lost and the earth, and no man's wit can well direct him where to look for it. Because remember, look at the science. If the sun is not circling the earth, and it is the earth that is circling the sun, put that in context of what he's preaching through the scriptures. And he's preaching these lines, and he's saying these sermons as the dean. He was the dean at St. Paul's Cathedral, albeit the structure that he was at then wasn't the one that we see now, which was designed by Christopher Wren, but the idea is the same: worship. Donne's poems were written to be passed hand to hand because they were in manuscript form during his lifetime. And the thing is, they're still being discovered. The intimacy helps us explain one of the most recognizable features of his work. And there's something else. I mean, if you read them, they shake you by the shoulder, because this is the man who wrote, "For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love." Do read Donne, John Donne. He's amazing. And he wrote that in his poem, The Canonization. He's a daring one. Because really look at what the priest writes about. He writes about a yoking on both the physical and the spiritual plane. And in this yoking, which John Donne turns the lovers' bodies into objects to emphasize that their souls have escaped and are now merging in the air to create a new joint soul. And when the lovers come together, they form, in other words, a new form free from defects, free from the defects of maleness or femaleness. He goes on an entirely different plane. But that really isn't even the end of the poem's chain of reasoning. What he says, that after achieving this ecstasy, Donne urges that the lovers return to their gendered bodies so that they can reenact their spiritual union on the physical plane. He's one of the most head-tripping poets I love, especially because I'm from India. Love without sex for him would be invisible and thereby incomplete. No celibacy for this priest. And I recognize his ardent longing for union with the beloved, because I'm very intimately familiar with the bhakti, which is the devotional poems from India. And these ideas from Indian poets from centuries, that in deep love, one longs to whisper the name of the beloved. And so in Sanskrit, one hears, "I utter your name," like a devotional activity, just as a devotee invokes the name of his Lord. Behold, the sexualization of the devotional, the sanctification of the erotic. One most obvious example are the works, the poems on Radha and Krishna, but there are many, many more beyond that. So in India, the erotic and religious sensibilities serve and are served by the pleasures of poetry. And the power of this kind of religious poetry truly lies in the turning of all human emotions within. So, I mean, look at the lines they write. As if to keep between us the secret of our guilt, your arms clung like vines on my neck. Sounds you uttered then, without meaning, yet not meaningless. My heartbeat now echoes them. And this is in Sanskrit. That language is structured for poetry. In Sanskrit, more often than not, things that are opposite in meaning are set to be rhythmic. So when you write them down, they lend eloquence without failure. And it keeps on writing. The passion for love in these erotic poems are the most preferred as the intense and most absorbing of all devotions. That is why they can say, "I see the face of my love clearly fixed before me, lips wounded by my teeth, trembling eyes gracefully closing, love's glow gleaming like clear moonlight." Because remember, Krishna is a god, Radha the devotee. That is how it's preached. I don't believe it, but the poems are rather beautiful. But what's even more important, in the current context and in the real context, the actual context is that Indian temple walls are visual poetry, because that is what they are conveying. Poetry, that's what those are. And if I mention the holy Indian city, Benares, one conjures sadhus, wise men like this. And one also thinks of the daily evening worship by the river Ganges, where the incense, the sounds of bells, and the poetic chanting, the hymns create an electric atmosphere for those who are truly devout. For everybody else, it's a photo fest. It's very noisy and clamorous. But at some point, when everything settles, it's worth remembering that Benares used to be an accepted city connected to the one great, without fail, Sanskrit poet, Kalidas. Just a snippet. The water lily closes, but with wonderful reluctancy, as if it troubled her to shut her door of welcome to the bee. Kalidas, a 5th century poet, one of his poems, a book of his poems, is called The Seasons. It is a very unpretentious writing, 6 short cantos, which breaks down the 6 seasons into which the Hindus divide the year. I'll simply read a small section from the summer version. Imagine Vivaldi's Seasons. Now this is in poetry form. So I'm going to read. The sunbeams like the fires are hot, that on the altar wake. The enmity is quite forgot of the peacock and of the snake. The peacock spares his ancient foe, for pluck and hunger fail. He hides his burning head below the shadow of his tail. Beneath the garland of the rays that leave no corner cool, the water vanishes in haze and leaves a muddy pool. The cobra does not hunt for food, nor need the frog at all, who finds beneath the serpent's hood a sheltering parasol. And that's just a translation. In Sanskrit, it's a wonder. That language is really made for poetry. And if you ever choose to learn the language, be very specific, because in this world, they'll teach Sanskrit by 2 forms. They will teach that yoga version, all that scientific terms for doing exercises, and you have a poetic version, a kavya version. Learn that version. That's the version worth learning if you're going to learn Sanskrit. The other version, please don't bother, in my opinion. So the 5th century poet Kalidas is revered by German masters like Schiller, by Goethe. So Schubert had tried to write an opera, Shakuntala, on one of Kalidas's work. So these are master poets. I haven't actually not touched his work at all. I've given you not even mere droplets of what he's done. And more of our times, the master poet, Rabindranath Tagore, Lord God of writing, if there ever was one, a great humanist. His magnificent secular work is peppered throughout the Nourishment Project's curriculum. I mean, look at the works. I mean, it says, and the morning comes with a golden wreath to silently crown the earth. Almost in every work the children do, there's poetry just lambent in everything that we offer. And I will now read just one poem from out of the 2,200, more than that Tagore has written. And he has written volumes of stories and essays. It is the one that Audrey Hepburn had requested be read by Gregory Peck at her funeral. It is called Unending Love. Here we go. I seem to have loved you in numberless forms, in numberless times, in life after life, in age after age, forever. My spellbound heart has made and remade the necklace of songs that you take as a gift, wear round your neck in your many forms, in life after life, in age after age, forever. Whenever I hear old chronicles of love, its age-old pain, its ancient tale of being apart or together, as I stare on and on into the past, in the end you emerge, clad in the light of a pole star, piercing the darkness of time. You become an image of what is remembered forever. You and I have floated here on the stream that brings from the fount, at the heart of time, love of one for another. We have played alongside millions of lovers, shared in the same shy sweetness of meeting, the same distressing tears of farewell. Old love, but in shapes that renew and renew forever. Today it is heaped at your feet. It has found its end in you. the love of man, of all man's days, both past and forever. Universal joy, universal sorrow, universal life, and memories of all loves merging with this one love of ours. I seem to have loved you in numberless forms, in numberless times, in life after life, in age after age, forever. You know, great poets are timeless because they belong to the whole world, and Tagore is definitely one of them. And poets like that are influenced by, and they carry their influence everywhere. And what was true for the 5th century Kalidas, because Kalidas influenced from the 5th century, 19th century German poets, it is absolutely true for Tagore. And I'm from Bengal, where Tagore is, and he's worshipped like God. And I promise you, he is influenced without doubt, from poets from around the world. He acknowledges it himself. He traveled the world. He was a prolific traveler. And the Mughal courts around the end of the time, because it was British rule, and so the Mughal courts that were there before the British, they had long dominated Indian writings in the courts, and those were writings in Persian. And so he knew how to read Persian poets. Courts in India spoke Persian. And so Persian poetry made an indelible mark on his mind, as did the bewildering richness of his history of the Sanskrit masterworks. And one of the first names that comes to mind at the mere mention of Persian poems is, for most of you, likely going to be Jalaluddin Rumi. Rumi's writing shows up on bestseller lists around the world, on T-shirts, on Instagram accounts. Philip Glass, the American composer, he has composed music to accompany Rumi's poetry, and he did a chamber music opera called Monsters of Grace, I think around 2007, in about an 800-year anniversary of Rumi's birth. And you have plenty of memorable Rumi's. He's the one who had written Unfold Your Own Myth. You will see these lines on people who work at Whole Foods. I have tried prudent planning long enough. From now on, I'll go mad. Things like that. And they're very selfie-inducing and Instagram looking, but I promise you, Rumi is much, much, much more than that. Rumi was actually a Persian scholar, and he had met this man Tabriz, as is shown in the illustration. Tabriz was a street merchant. He used to be a hawker seller. There are many versions of this story. And he's often described, Tabriz, as a dervish, one who is constantly seeking God. And Rumi and Tabriz had a profound connection. And years later, when Tabriz was murdered, reportedly by one of Rumi's followers, and some say out of jealousy by Rumi's own son, Rumi went mad with grief. And out of that deafening, blinding grief, poured his poems that now show up everywhere. And these are purely love poems, love on an entirely different level. And you must know by now the destination that the vehicle of poetry takes me without fail every time. I have used poetry in every single class, including those with you. And for example, take this quote from that garden series long time ago from the Islamic gardens. The gardens may flow in beauty, but let us go to the gardener himself. So Sufi poets like Rumi abound in those times and areas, which of the 12th, 13th century. So the 13th century poem Yunus Emre, who is shown on the Turkish banknotes, he writes, I haven't come here to settle down. I have come here to depart. I didn't come here to create any problems. I am only here to love. He, love, is my teacher. I am his servant. I am a nightingale in his garden. And as we approach our destination, behold, Ibn Arabi, another Sufi. It is his exaltation. I fled from myself to him. Now there's a voyage. Utter selflessness, to leave myself behind, to leave my ego behind, to submit to love and await acceptance in the humble offerings. Accept me. His poems had been introduced at the Islamic garden presentation. Oh, marvel, a garden amidst the flames. My heart is capable of every form. And so now the real beauty in those words. If you've ever felt something is missing from your life, that there is more to life than whatever this is, that kind of low-level despondency is the fire, the flame that this poet refers to. Trouble at work, quarrel with your spouse, money problems, the myriad things that afflict us, and the flames lick higher. You add even more fuel, the death of a loved one, the loss of love, and your entire world awakens in flame. And there, then you realize the preceding lines of the poem, which says pasture between breastbone and innards. Where is that? Where is the pasture between your breastbone and innards? Right here. It's the physical heart, the pasture, the sanctuary amidst all the pain is to be in love, to submit, to be vulnerable, to love, that I bow to you. Bound to you is when I am free. To courageously submit completely to that which is much, much, much larger than any one of us. That submission is the basic openness of love. And that ever-present pasture is in our lives all the time. If we have the courage to choose love, no matter what. That realization is not one of intellect. It never is. It happens only in the spirit. And it happens ideally when the vehicle is silence. The next best vehicle is poetry. And my heart dances when I find it over and over and over and over, again and again, to you. Thank you for your time.